Good afternoon, good evening, good night, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. This is Dr. Ferdinand, and this is part of a series of Gold Standard GAMSAT monthly free webinars. Um, this this time we are going to be discussing GAMSAT Written Communication, also called Section 2. So the plan is that I will go over some ideas that are important for you, and I'll take some look at some excerpts from the book, and then we will discuss strategies. And finally, I'll give you a topic, and hopefully you have some A4 sheets of paper, not unlike what you will have for the real exam, and you will plan an essay. So you'll be given some time to plan an essay. So this webinar is 1 hour long. We won't have time for you to complete your masterpiece, but you will have time to plan an essay. Okay, so first of all, as you guys know, of course, I'm going to be saying some things that you know already before we get to some strategies, but some people are haven't done the background that you may have done. So, as you may know, that written communication used to be called Section 2 because it was the second section of the exam. It is now the first section of the exam. So ACER is just calling it written communication now. And this is the part that you will be doing. You'll be sitting this in 2 weeks if it is the case that you intend to complete the March 2026 exam. Now, in terms of the relative importance of this exam to you, obviously, you know what most students do. Most students spend the great majority of their study time on the sciences, irrespective of their academic background. And yet, at least for some medical programs and dental programs, the written communication ends up being 1/3 of your overall score. Imagine spending as much time on written communication as you do on the sciences. Almost no one does that. Yet it is relatively that important for many programs. Of course, as you know, there are some programs that will weight the sciences twice. So in the end, half of your overall GAMSAT score will come from the sciences, and the other half will come from the non-sciences. Either way, your written communication is either worth 25% or 33 and a third percent of your overall GAMSAT score. That is underlining its relative importance. And it does mean that you need to spend a certain number of hours preparing in order to optimize your score, unless your academic background is such that you're certain that you're going to get a high score and you don't need to do all that background study. In terms of this section of the exam, there is no quote more important than the following in terms of your preparation. By the way, this person doesn't know that GAMSAT exists, but they happen to have a very pertinent quote for written communication, for your preparation. Write, rewrite. When not writing or rewriting, read. I know of no shortcuts. This is so important for this exam. It's not a matter of just reading and reading. It is a matter that you have to be writing dozens and dozens of essays yourself. It's not a spectator sport. You can just read about it. You have to actually be performing. And so writing is essential. And then you adapt, you improve. Now, they wrote, I know no shortcuts, but of course, that quote was probably before a lot of our modern technology. So there are a few shortcuts, which I will mention later. Shortcuts will involve things like TED.com, which you can be watching every few days. Crash course on YouTube. So that's Crash Course History, Crash Course Philosophy. I know some people prefer other short videos on philosophy or history, but Crash Course History or Philosophy, easy to retain. But of course, you must take notes when you watch them. And of course, AI. of course, is going to assist you in this. Now, for those who do have the book, it is helpful to have an idea of some of the topics that have come up in the past for writing task A and writing task B. You see, the topics tend to be more of a social, cultural, sometimes, government or democracy ends up coming up rather often in writing task A. And writing task B tends to be more personal, reflective type of essay. Topics like joy, aging, youth, love, etc. So you can see that there is a tendency to have different emphases. But politics can be used for approximately half writing task A essays over the years. It doesn't mean that the word is specific to that, but it overlaps with examples, analogies, and metaphors that can be done for that. And the other things that I would just quickly mention um, is you want to plan your essay. I'm going to give you the general plan in a little while when we talk about strategies, about a general plan on how to plan your essay. And I'm also going to tell you that, of course, you can have a perfect plan for the essay, but some of you are more creative writers, or some of you have a specific area in which you're really good at. Some people are great at reflective writing. Some people are great at argumentative writing. So in the end, especially 2 weeks ahead of exam, you're going to go with your strengths. There's no doubt about it. Although I will be explaining what are the uh, ideal structured ways to deal with it. And then I will explain that you can just destroy the structure and go according to your personal strengths. I would mention that there's language that you can use to improve the quality of your essay. And if you have the book, it's in the book. But if you don't, there's apps that have vocabulary that they can suggest a few words every day for you to learn, and then retest you on those words later. And then when the exam itself begins, you will be given some, like I said, some A4 sheets of paper. Of course, the written communication section will have A4 that you will have at home. You also have the option to have a whiteboard. But on your A4 sheet of paper, once the online proctor allows you to begin, then you can, if you've had, say, 10 or so beautiful words that you have in mind, you can just write them down on your A4 sheet of paper before you even look at the question itself. And that way you can seek to see if there's an appropriate place for you to incorporate some new language, some beautiful expressions that you kept in mind for your essay. So I'm not saying you have to memorize 50 new words, but a dozen? Can you do that in a couple of weeks? Sure you can. The other thing I will mention, because I'm going to be mentioning another book that some students use to prepare, but in this book, it has 100 sample or essays that students who scored very high on the exam were able to write in the appropriate time period, 2 essays in 65 minutes. And and this can be helpful, for ideas, for titles, for analogies, for anecdotes, and so on. The other source that I will be mentioning, if you don't have the book, if you have the book, you don't need it. But if you don't have the book, there's a smaller book called A.C. Grayling, The Meaning of Things. And this has, and it doesn't matter what edition you have of this book. And so you can get it for 10 of any currency that you use. 10 quid or pounds or 10 euros or 10 Australian dollars because you can just get it on the secondhand market or you can go to your local library. And what it has is very short essays on the type of topics that come up on the exam regularly. So it's a very it's very useful. Of course, if you have the book, you already have 100 essays, but if not, you can go to your local library or whatever. And by the way, this book is also available at local libraries and bookshops, in the three, oh, actually more than just the three countries, Australia, UK, and Ireland. It's also in Singapore. Okay, now I'm going to ask my helpful assistant Viv to give you a handout so that we can start looking at some strategies that you can apply to written communication. So Viv, give me the handout. Okay, so some of the things, I'm sorry, I know you know already, but we'll get to the meat. So, of course, you have 65 minutes. Don't start until your online proctor allows you to begin. You'll be doing this as a computer-based test in your home. Or whatever private location that you can have. Sometimes they'll be checking with a mirror about what you have in the room so that you're not cheating, and they'll also be they'll also have software that can be looking at your eye movements and your other body movements, whatever, to suggest whether or not you might be cheating. So this is not some online exam that you did for your uni course. This is more sophisticated. It uses a more sophisticated process to look for problems of cheating, and that includes the language that you use in your essays. So you can't memorize an essay that you used before and then try it again on the next exam because ACER has both external and internal checks for plagiarism. So external meaning on the World Wide Web, obviously, but internal with respect to anyone who sat one of their exams before. So, of course, you can use a sentence, a phrase, an example, but if you use word for word an essay, they're going to catch you, So these are all things that they are looking for. So you're going to be presented with 4 or 5 quotes or comments. They may or may not be, they may or may not have the name of the person, but normally, lately, they don't. And you'll be mostly graded on your ability to articulate your perspective and synthesize ideas, express ideas, and write clearly using standard English and appropriate grammar, spelling, and punctuation. That's probably the least important. You can have some mistakes from time to time. That's okay. But if your mistakes are such that it becomes difficult to read, and worse, it becomes difficult to understand what you're trying to say, then that's where it becomes a disaster. We already said about the relative importance for your GAMSAT score. So who scores great? Those are the people who have sort of natural charisma. It doesn't matter if they have experience writing essays, but they just have natural charisma. So the kind of person who walks into a party and then a spontaneous circle forms around them because everyone's fascinated with the stories that they have to tell. Normally, they do great with little to no preparation. Then there are people with skills, and yeah, that ends with a Z or Z. And these are people with mad skills. These are people who they've done an undergraduate degree in English literature or history or philosophy or economics or law. Yeah, there's lawyers who are sitting GAMSAT, and I can tell you, they can do some pretty good argumentative essays when you have a law degree, and the power of their arguments is that they can come up with very specific examples that they can illustrate well. Okay, But then there's the 90% of people who are sitting GAMSAT. And so this is the category where, you have to look that you're going to be completing at least 20 to 40 essays. So unless you have special skills, and you know that you have those skills because you set GAMSAT before, or you've used Acer's online marker, um, then, in those conditions, of course, you're going to emphasize whatever other weakness that you might have for GAMSAT. But you have to be thinking, you have to complete a lot of essays before the exam. And it's not the end of the world. I mean, look, the exam's in a couple of weeks. A few essays a day could really be helpful. Next, some people wonder about titles. Titles can be very powerful. If you have, a beautiful title in Latin, compos mentis. I mean, there's so many beautiful Latin expressions that can be used that are introductions to your essay, and, vox populi is an expression that means the voice of the people. And that's good enough for half of the writing task A essays that are related to democracy in some way or to government in some way. The voice of the people, vox populi. And there's just too many to come to mind. But if it's interesting and inviting, but if you write a title like some students in primary school or early high school, junior high or something, write titles where they're giving all the information of the essay in the title, then forget it. Then that's not useful. It has to be something that engenders some curiosity, fascination, um, to allow someone to go further. But a title is not necessary to the essay. It can be an amazing essay without a title. Number of words don't count either. Uh, you know, whether you're writing what we would estimate as double space 1 page or 2 or 3 pages, that does not dictate whether or not you will get a high score. However, there is a partial correlation with longer essays, 2 to 3 pages, double space with good scores. But the reason is indirect, and that is that people tend to be providing detailed examples. And when there are more details, it shows a greater understanding of the topic at hand. But there are people who've written very short essays who have gotten good scores as well. The priority is the ideas and writing with passion. Okay, so these things are a little bit obvious. It has to be relevant to the theme. Whoa. Now that sounds quick and easy, but this is the only way a good writer gets a bad score for GAMSAT. And that's if a good writer looks at the quotes or the comments and then starts writing about one of them. Just starts, oh yes, I got lots of ideas for that. Now it's going to be hit or miss, because you have to understand the 4 or 5 comments that Acer is giving, they all relate to a common theme. And so you must identify the theme before you start writing. If you just take a comment, then it could be in or out of context. Who knows? You might have hit it on the nail, but you might have taken it out of context, and now your whole essay is going off the rails. So that's why a good or great writer can only get a bad mark if they take it out of context and they don't answer Acer's question. Because Acer's question is for you to write your essay about the theme, but use 1 or more comments in order to advance your ideas. So you're going to use 1 or 2 comments, but you're really writing about the theme. That's the underlying issue. Now, in terms of the difficulty, there is no difficulty about the theme. You're not going to be sitting there saying, what is this about? What are these 4 comments about? Because the comments Acer chooses tend to repeat the keywords or have synonyms or antonyms to the keywords. And because it's 4 comments, you're going to see it I mean, it's repetitive. So you're going to be able to see the theme. You just have to make sure that that's what you're writing about and you're using one or more comments to advance that. Of course, well thought out opinion, sound reasoning, evidence. Okay, so it's one thing for you to be in a pub with your friends and discussing an issue, and it's another thing for you to be writing a formal essay that's going to help you get into medical or dental school. So you have to check the language that you're using and also check the evidence that you are providing. It's so it's a little bit more, and that's why I mentioned TED.com, Crash Course History, Crash Course Philosophy, and I'll mention a few others. And that's why I mentioned the book, the Masters Series Written Communication, or AC Grayling's The Meaning of Things, because these are all sources that are providing you with evidence, proof of your statement. And don't worry, don't be thinking right now, oh my goodness, it's 2 weeks from now. There's not enough time. I can't, acquire evidence for political arguments or philosophical arguments or historical arguments. But you better believe you have enough time because I mean, it ends up being, I don't know, perhaps 45 minutes a day, an hour a day, in which you watch some very short videos, 5 minutes, 10 minutes videos, take notes, because that's the key thing. There's no use watching if you're just relying on your memory between now and the exam. So you watch videos, take brief notes, check your notes from the beginning, study from your notes from the beginning every couple of days to consolidate the information. Of course, the essay should be well structured. So let's talk about that. I'm going to go over with you briefly the gold standard GAMSAT 5-minute, 5-step plan for structuring your essay. So first, you're going to read. So in the olden days, meaning before the pandemic, Acer had a 60-minute for 2 essays and 5 minutes reading time. In the 5 minutes reading time, you were not allowed to write anything. You couldn't scribble a thing. If you did, your whole exam was going to be nullified. Uh, but now, Acer says, in 2026, they say they incorporate the reading time into the exam time. So you get a total of 65 minutes. So that's blah, blah, blah. You have 65 minutes for the exam to complete the exam. So when that timer begins, you can start taking notes. You can start putting down your great ideas. Some students call this a brain dump. You have some analogies or gorgeous words or expressions, or metaphors that you want to remember. And you might have been studying 1 hour before the exam starts, right? Because, I mean, written communication is done on its own. So you could have been looking at that just before, and then the exam starts, boom, you start writing down those expressions before you even look at what you're going to be asked about. And it's not because I'm trying to tell you to use expressions in the wrong context. Obviously, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that you're going to be able to look at a buffet in front of you and to be able to decide what is relevant to these topics in order for me to optimize my essay. So of course, you're going to read the comments and you're going to identify the themes. Then you will pre-write. So you're going to write your main paragraphs on the scratch paper that you have, because there's no copy paste for the essays as of now. Okay, who knows about 2027? But for now, there's no copy paste. And that means that you don't want to be caught in a situation where you see that you put things, helter skelter. And how do you correct that, under time pressure? So it's better to plan your essay just in point form, and then to write it. I'm going to explain how you organize the essay, but then step 4 in the 5-step plan is obviously you're going to write, which means type. Ideally, what you're going to do over the next couple of weeks is every day you complete a written communication essay. You do it using the same seat, same table, same computer, same room that you intend to have for the real exam. There's lots of studies that show that when you do this, it optimizes your score because the familiarity of these things in the back of your mind, these little subconscious things, helps you to access information in your head easier. So do your practice there. In fact, you should also practice your essays at the same time of the day that you intend to have the real exam. And the proofreading part at the end is only helping you in terms of avoiding the situation where you made a grammatical error or a spelling error so bad that it makes it difficult to understand the sentence and possibly even to understand the paragraph. So that's what you're really trying to do. I mean, a few mistakes here and there is not going to change your score, but you don't want to have any disasters waiting for you. Okay, so more detail about the organization. So as I mentioned before, the first task deals mostly with social cultural issues, and the second one more with personal and social issues. And so for writing task A common way to address it, as I mentioned before, half of them has to do with government or democracy. So a common way to address it is argumentative essay. And in an argument, an essay, you start by presenting your thesis. So you will be able to use one of the quotes here in your thesis. And here you explain your interpretation of the quote itself. You know, what do those words mean for you? So you give that some sort of definition. And if you're a person who can write a lot, then you can give an example of your thesis. So you don't just present it, but you give an example of it. And then you do the opposite, the antithesis or antithesis. So here you're going to be, because you're giving an example of the opposite, Acer will have a quote for the opposite. So that means for sure you're going to be able to use two quotes. You just use the quote for the opposite, explain it in your own words, and then you give a detailed, elaborate example. Not just one sentence, you'll have several sentences exploring it. What year did it happen? Where? When? And of course, you only say things that you're sure you know. During the exam, you don't have access to Google. But after the exam, the correctors have access to Google. So don't say something that you're not sure of. You can couch it in your words. Sometime in the 1940s, instead of saying in 1941, December 3rd, just use your words to say, my recollection is, and that's fine. They understand this is these essays are completed in 30 something minutes. So perfection is not necessary. And then you have the synthesis. And this is where you say where this applies and where this applies. Now, synthesis, some people interpret that as being, oh, so you have to be gray or something. You have to sit on the fence. That's not true at all. Synthesis really, it's affirmative. For example, freedom of speech, common issue that comes up on essays. And people will talk about the importance of freedom of speech. Liberal democracies, the success of these democracies. People live comfortably. Freedom of speech has a lot to do with that. Creativity, production in industry, whatever. And then we go to the opposite and we look at times in which freedom of speech, didn't work out so well. There is societies in which people went on radios and encouraged others to kill, to harm other people. There's a famous issue about screaming fire in a crowded theater. Some jurisdictions, it's illegal if there is no fire because people have been injured or died because of that. And then the classic synthesis is that your freedoms end where my freedoms begin. And so you have freedoms up to an extent, but if that is being used to harm others, that is the line. And so it is an affirmative resolution to the problem. And writing task B, personal. You can remember A for argumentative and B for personal, which is personal misspelt. And here you have the introduction, which is done the same way. You have a quote that you use, put in your own words, give an example if you have time. Then the body of the essay has two segments. Social implication, how does, um, you know, whatever courage affects society, in what way is it important? And then a separate paragraph. This might be the first time you use the pronoun I all day. It depends on your style, but you can do the first one in the third person. And here you turn to personal reflection. I looked in the mirror. I was not proud. I didn't see things the way I see things now. I improved, I worked on it, whatever. Self-redemption story is always something that people find attractive. And then your conclusion, and it doesn't need to be argumentative. You can push your view on the topic as a reflective essay. Okay, so let's break the rules. Breaking the rules, exploring creativity. First of all, there are some people who only like to argue. I mentioned there are some lawyers who are going to sit this exam. They might want to do both as argumentative. That's up to them because they have that talent. And there are some people they only like to write reflective essays, but they've done it so much that they're very good at it. So I'm just putting it as a safe. These are safe ways to apply to people who don't have the background in essay writing and are coming to it de novo. There's other things you can do. There's people who've written letters, dear mom, dear editor, dear Miss Prime Minister, dear Mr. President, breakup letters in the essay for medical school admission that ended up helping them get into medical school. Short stories, fictional, historical narrative, poems. So you imagine if you write a poem, it's not going to be 3 pages long in written communication. So it might just end up being a page or less than a page, but it might be so well done and so creative and incorporate both the themes and the quotations. Diary entries, debate conversations. Don't forget, there's going to be opposing quotes or comments that are presented to you. Imagine there are two people who are arguing, and you set up a hypothetical or a possible historical discussion, and they go back and forth in this discussion, and they naturally bring up these quotes, not because they're quoting the quotes, but they are saying the quotes as if the words are from themselves. Of course, the words are not from you, but the words are from these hypothetical characters. That's a beautiful way to use quotes, as opposed to some students who will write their title as comment number 3 and then rewrite the entire comment in their essays. There are far more creative ways to do that. Some people have done social media posts, even with using acronyms or tweeting Trump, or it's better said with the X analogy based on your hobbies. But this is like the worst thing to do. This is when you have nothing better to say, and but at least try to put some kind of twist at the end there. There are many resources you can use, as I mentioned, for beautiful words and expressions. There are apps for that and exercises, but all of this is in the Gold Standard Masters Series book. Uh, if you are preparing for September, you have time to open yourself to the debate. So local, national, global newspapers, National, Guardian, Irish Times, the Australian, and there are so many other local papers. And if you have access, things like New York Times, The Economist, which are in your local uni library, and you go to the editorial section, also called the comment pages of these, and you don't have to read anything. You only read what interests you. So when you see an article on a topic that interests you, then you read that and you take brief notes and you look to incorporate that into your essay writing. Very powerful. I've already mentioned The Meaning of Things by A.C. Grayling. And, there's sample essays in our forum at gamsatprep.com. You can look at some sample essays and some comments on those essays. And there are uh, essay correction services, obviously. There is Acer, who uses AI. They used AI before AI started becoming popular, before ChatGPT became popular, because Acer's AI is internal system. So they have corrected essays. They have the same topics every year for their corrected 16 essays in their program. And because they have them already in their system and they have the language and the correctors in their system, they're able to give fairly accurate scores. And it's not expensive because it's all automated, so they don't have to get involved very much. It's the same topics every year, and it's a very useful tool. Um, there is gold standard essay correction service. Ours is more cumbersome because it's experts who are correcting the essays. The scores cannot be as accurate as Acer's. It's impossible because Acer has tens of thousands of people who have submitted, but the it's personal advice that is being provided in order to improve. And of course, people are using just standard AI. AI, again, AI cannot give accurate scores. You can give AI information about Acer, GAMSAT, but AI doesn't have the specific program that Acer uses in order to create standard scoring. And Acer has have some research articles on it. You can look them up on item response theory for the scoring system, but AI still cannot computate accurately. Acer is far more accurate for that. But of course, AI can be a companion. It can be a companion to help you improve language, presentation. You can ask AI specific questions on how to improve your thinking for and your presentation of ideas for essays and even titles if you wish. So there are good ways to use that. Okay, that's enough blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to ask Vivian to provide today's handout for the questions, or is the questions already on that? Okay, I it's possible. I think you might have the question already here. It's a writing task A. And so I'm going to ask for a 10-minute clock in which you will be able to write your plan your essay. You will be able to plan your essay, and then you can start writing. You can start writing anywhere, introduction, body, conclusion, but plan your essay and even some titles. If there's a powerful title that comes to your mind, you can you can start that. So if we can get a clock for 10 minutes, please. Begin and good luck. Okay, so that's time. 5 minutes should be a plenty of time for you to plan your essays. Um, I should say that if you want to share your masterpiece, you can do so by going to our forum at gamsatprep.com/forum, and you can share your masterpiece there, and others can share titles or just a few sentences or your plan, and you will get some commentary. Also, in your handout, there's an example from a student who gave a response to this essay so that you can look at a good response from an essay topic like this. So you can compare your response or where you were going with the student's response in the handout that you have. And some of you already know I've been putting the worked solutions to Acer's brand new 2026 GAMSAT Practice Test A ebook on YouTube. So you can access them, those worked solutions there for free. There's only one unit I haven't done yet, and it's actually the easiest unit in the exam. It's one on genetics, and I will be posting that, I hope and dream, within 24 hours. I also give 3-hour tutorials every weekend, Saturday and Sunday, leading up to the exam. And so Viv will put a link there if you want to attend one of those 3-hour tutorials. Aside from that, we will continue our 1-hour free tutorials from here until the exam. So I wish you good luck with your studies, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.